From Israel Adesanya predicting the Predator's shocking UFC return, to Chael Sonnen calling Dana White's bluff of never letting him come back, here's how the UFC community reacts to Francis Ngannou returning to the UFC. For one, Adesanya is pretty sure this is just a phase, and Ngannou is meant to return to the UFC no matter what. And I know what you're thinking. He turned down an $8 million offer for his dream fight, simply because he had other demands that the UFC president wasn't ready to bow down to. Then, what makes Adesanya think the former heavyweight champion is finally going to return? Well, you're right, his UFC exit was pretty controversial, even though he had reasonable demands, like better fighter pay and healthcare insurance. But if there's one thing we know about Dana White, it's that he hates talking about fighter pay, whether it's coming from Ngannou or anyone else. And pouring millions of dollars into the deal wasn't going to make this any better. So when PFL gave him everything he asked for, Ngannou was quick to grab onto it. And now he's got equity in the company, a leadership role, and the freedom to kickstart his boxing career. As for Izzy, he's looking at the people doubting Ngannou's transition, and even though he's negotiating his boxing debut against Deontay Wilder, Izzy's asking fans and critics to be a little more patient. Because the Predator's story was always unique right from the start, even before he paved his way to the UFC, and he's doing that again with PFL. But like Izzy said, the story's not over yet, because he's not the kind of guy that just quits in a second. And sure, White said some stuff in the past, but we all know it doesn't take long for him to go back on his words. Think about the time he claimed women weren't ever going to fight in the UFC. Fast forward to 2023, everything's different. And remember how he's always been against crossover fights? Well, it turns out he's ready for one. If it's between the heavyweight champions Jon Jones and Tyson Fury, sure, there are a lot of details to iron out before that happens. But White's ready for a crossover fight between the two now. So who's to say that he'll welcome Ngannou back into the UFC when the time's right? If you ask me, all he needs is a huge payday. And with the kind of talent and rep Ngannou's got, a blockbuster fight with him is gonna get millions of dollars. Like Izzy said, UFC messed with Ngannou for a pretty long time, but once he goes around and takes advantage of his freedom, they're gonna pay him what he deserves. And that's when Ngannou will finally come back to where he belongs. As of now, his last professional fight was against Cyril Gane back in January 2022, and his next won't be until 2024, although he's planning to kickstart his boxing career before his PFL in the same year. That said, he's going to be one of the most highly paid fighters, topped with all the sponsorship deals while fighting inside the deal. And if that wasn't enough, he's also going to be the chairman for PFL Africa, so there's a lot in it for him. And that was exactly what he wanted, which he was transparent about right from the start, whether it was with the UFC or One, who, by the way, tried to save face and claimed they were withdrawing from the deal because Francis was honest with them about his demands. Even the UFC offered him a deal that would have made Ngannou the highest paid heavyweight in history, which is exactly why White's so bitter. I mean, they worked with this guy for 2 years, and even tried to get him the showdown with Jones he needed. So, if you ask me, even though the PFL deal might sound like he's earning a lot, but let's be honest, he'll be making far less from PPVs. Because here's the deal, the PFL doesn't really have the same reach as the UFC, even if it's emerging as a new challenger for the top spot right now. On top of that, there's also the fact that UFC Africa will be much bigger than PFL Africa, and Ngannou can add a lot more value to it. And it's not just that. He's got a bunch of reasons to come back, with the fight against Jon Jones being the biggest example. But there are other factors you can't ignore either, like fame, better competition, and million-dollar deals. Let's not forget, White offered the biggest payday to Ngannou, just to negotiate a deal with him. So clearly, money isn't an issue for the UFC. If anything, it's the driving force for White's decisions. And if you think about it, how many fighters are going to think about stepping into the PFL just to fight Francis? Sure, it's a huge payday for anyone who gets up in the cage with them, but who's willing to go all the way for it? On the other hand, the second a controversy comes up and there's a big ripple in the game, UFC might even end up changing their strategy. That said, there's a possibility that free agents might come into the mix. And there's a huge possibility that Ngannou's first MMA fight with PFL might be against an opponent who's ready to test their own value in the free agency market. But is that what the former heavyweight champion wants? Sure, he's inspiring more fighters than I can count, but he's too good to be tied down for money and chairman roles while fighting mediocre fights just for the sake of it. And I'm not the only one saying that. Even Daniel Cormier thinks a return to the UFC is Ngannou's best option. In fact, he thinks the former heavyweight champion could walk right into big fights if he returned to the octagon. And let's be honest, leaving the UFC has cut down a bunch of his options and opportunities. And if there's one thing the MMA community can't get over, is the Jones vs. Ngannou fight that never happened. I mean, after a 2-year hiatus from active competition when he was finally back, was the exact time Ngannou decided to step out from the competition, vacating his heavyweight belt. And Jones came back to fight for the same title, only for an incredible win over Cyril Gane. That made him the UFC heavyweight champion. Although, I gotta admit, a fight between the two is gonna be even bigger now, given the title and competition. So will Ngannou come back to reclaim his position? Only time will tell. But for now, there's a bunch of fighters who aren't on board with his move, and they're speaking from experience. Like Conor McGregor, who was one of the first to criticize his UFC exit. Simply said, he claimed Ngannou made a huge mistake leaving the UFC, even after PFL fulfilled all his demands. Sure, McGregor's happy for him, but a resolution with the UFC should have been his goal. No one's asking him to settle and give up what he believes in, but maybe all he needs is a reality check. Because let's face it, with the kind of boxing debut he's after, with top heavyweights like the Gypsy King, Deontay Wilder, or even Anthony Joshua, there's a big possibility that he's gonna face a humiliating defeat. And that right there will end all his dreams of a boxing legacy. And once that happens, would he find the PFL deal better than UFC anyway? I don't think so. And like McGregor said, even if his PFL opponents get a $2 million payday, who's he gonna be up against? After the kind of competition he got in the UFC, I don't think he'd be lucky to get anything even close to that. And that's exactly why Dana White thinks the PFL deal is a no-risk strategy from Ngannou's side, especially after how one backed down after he put down his demands. If I'm being honest, he didn't really have a lot of options piling up for him either. To top it off, Chael Sonnen called White's bluff. In fact, he thinks no one should take the UFC president's comments at face value. At best, all he's trying to do is save face after how Ngannou turned down the biggest payday he could get. And shutting down any chances of a UFC return is the only way to get an edge over the situation. And if you ask Chael, he thinks Ngannou still has the evidence he needs to go back to the UFC. Sure, White says he's never going to talk to him, but it all boils down to a good round of negotiation that can change the entire game. Plus, if you think about it, the former heavyweight champion's demands weren't unrealistic either. He already had better fighter pay, and once he dips his toes in boxing, I think he's going to get over it soon enough after a defeat. And that's when he'll reach out to the UFC for another contract. So, there you have it. From Chael Sonnen calling Dana White's bluff of never letting him come back, to Israel Adesanya predicting the Predator's shocking UFC return. That was how the UFC community reacted to Francis Ngannou returning to the UFC.